So Pokemon is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, and that is obviously pretty special for a number of different reasons. Pokemon is one of the biggest media and video game franchises of all time, and as such, being that it's the 25th anniversary, it also makes it a really good time to touch on the series' history. And Pokemon, as a video game franchise in particular, has one of the richest histories of any video game series out there. So as a real fan of the history of Pokemon in particular, I thought now would be a good a time as any to talk about some of the biggest moments in the series history of all time. However, I did not just want to do this on my own, and I've decided to recruit someone who's probably the most knowledgeable person in the community, at least that I'm aware of, to discuss this with me, and that would be none other than Dr. Lava. Thank you, man, for being here. I really appreciate it, and I'm just excited to be able to talk about this with you.
Hey, what's up, Hoops? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about Pokemon history today, and the general topic in particular is the biggest, most important moments throughout the series history, at least in my own opinion anyway, for the 25th anniversary. Of all of the different sub-genres, I guess you could say, of Pokemon content, the historical side of it has always been like easily my favorite. I think just the behind the scenes stuff, just learning about the development, the cut content, like I just eat that stuff up. So it's definitely, whenever I get a chance to cover that side of it on my channel, I jump at the chance because it's just really fun to talk about. And speaking of, we might as well go ahead and get at these different moments I've got. And one of the picks I've got is the general I guess you could say hack of the servers and all the leaks that resulted as a result of that. You had the gold and silver one was obviously the biggest one, but then you also there was an additional gold and silver one after that. There was the diamond and pearl beta leak that happened after that. If you're not fully in tune with that kind of stuff that's been going on, I've covered it on my channel, but there's basically just been a ton of leaks over recent years that have revealed a ton of beta content and just cut content in general, including like a lot of Pokemon and characters, and just it shows a wildly different view and direction for the games that we would never get to see otherwise. And I think that was, like, even though it's so recent, I think it's easily one of the more important moments that we've had in the series history, because Pokemon are so unbelievably like close to the chest with their cut content and their behind the scenes stuff. They don't share that hardly at all in any way. So to have it, even if it was through the means of a leak, to be able to get a glimpse of that and preserve it, so like we as fans not only can see it, but also be able to just make sure it stays preserved and it gets recorded as a part of history, was honestly huge. And you obviously played a big part in that.
A lot of the original work I've done was involved with translations and maybe just kind of presenting a lot of those leaks in a more palatable format for folks, because you know, like there'll be like an info dump or something like that online, and I guess you could say just like the most hardcore folks sift through it, and then, you know, I'll just kind of like make some tweets and be like, well, like here's one aspect of it in a really easy to understand format, and you know, and like here's some nice art to go right next to the beta sprite, and just kind of break it down piece by piece. So I guess, yeah, a lot of the time I'm sort of downstream, except for translations. When it comes to leaks, I'm really downstream and just kind of like making it accessible to just folks who don't want to sift through a bunch of, you know, pile of stuff. So I don't want to take more credit than I deserve by any means.
But I mean, as far as like the translations, as you mentioned, I think that's a thing that you have done that really has brought to light a lot of stuff. Like I was reading an article that you had translated on your website, and it was talking about the time that Ishihara, the CEO of the Pokemon Company, met Satoshi Tajiri, and it basically was a huge amount of happenstance, because as the interview goes, Tajiri, or Ishihara rather, was working at a TV production company, and they had the idea to make a show about video games, and Satoshi Tajiri was becoming known in the video game scene at the time as like a guru or a knowledgeable guy, and so Ishihara just happened to bring him on because of that, and that's how they ultimately met, was because of this TV show that Ishihara was going to produce as his former job, and so it kind of snowballed from there. And that is a huge moment in history, in my opinion, as far as Pokemon goes, because I think there's a lot of just right place, right time type of moments when it comes to like how Pokemon came to be, and that one is obviously a huge one with those two kind of coming together.
Yeah, it's kind of funny in that interview. Ishihara is just sort of like, well, I didn't really know anything about Galaga, and Tajiri did, so I partnered up with him. You know, of course, they didn't know that they were, you know, on the road to making the biggest multimedia franchise in the world, and so, you know, it starts off with them just being like, oh, this dude knows a lot about Galaga. Like, yeah, okay, well, he knows a lot about, like, arcade games and stuff, so let me just bring this guy on. And, of course, like, these small little ripples ended up making a big splash out in the future that reverberated over the next 30 years or so. So it is fun. It's weird that a lot of this stuff hasn't already been translated, honestly. Like, it's, you know, the biggest multimedia franchise in the world. There's, you know, tens of millions of fans, and there's just these interviews with the founders basically talking about how it started, and just like no one went to the trouble of translating them is it's kind of weird. No one just went to the trouble over the last, you know, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, if I remotely had any capability of reading, writing, or understanding Japanese, I would be all over that, because, like I said, it's just, I find it not only fascinating, but just super important, too, that stuff is known about. But getting back to the whole just meeting of the minds and how it came together, like, as I mentioned, the Ishihara Tajiri meeting where they met because of that show, that's only like one example of just a complete just happenstance type of thing where the pieces of Game Freak came together in a just it was very much just fate almost that it happened. And another really good example of that is Ken Sugimori getting involved in Game Freak, because he literally just stumbled upon the Game Freak magazine, which was just a magazine at the time that Tajiri had been making to basically not categorize, but just talk about games and like provide tips and tricks, and like that's literally the origin of Game Freak. It was for game freaks. It started as a magazine, which is obviously another huge point in the history. But to have Ken Sugimori just like walking in a shop and being like, oh, hey, that's cool, like that would be fun to like get involved in, and just have that just basically fall into your like lap, essentially, to where these two people get brought together that way. I just think that's such a cool story, because it's almost like a movie where all the pieces just come together at the exact right time in the exact right place to like be able to create something this special.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like if, you know, that particular magazine or comic book shop had like a different display. They'd had, you know, some other magazine in that particular spot, or, you know, something, or they happened to be sold out of Game Freak that day. Because, you know, Tajiri was, I'm sure you know this, but maybe some folks know, that he was photocopying these handwritten pages and stapling them together at his parents' house. So it's not like it was some magazine where there was, you know, like Electronics Gaming Monthly or something, where there was a million copies in every Barnes and Nobles. It was like, you know, it was handmade. He was stapling it at home from his parents' place. So, you know, if they just happened to have been like sold out of their 3 issues or whatever that day, then, you know, Pokemon never would have happened. So yeah, it's interesting how things work out.
Yeah, that is another great point, is the fact that the magazine was literally handwritten, hand copied, stapled by hand. It was just Tajiri literally being so enthusiastic about games that he wanted to make it's almost like a 90s version of a YouTube channel, except he made it as a magazine. And it just kind of spiraled out of control in the most wonderful way possible.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, he's like, yeah, like the 80s version of Angry Video Game Nerd or something. Satoshi Tajiri.
Yeah, absolutely, because there's also a lot of stories of how like he was cutting class in high school just because all he cared about was like video games and like not only playing them but figuring out how they worked. And so it's really a story of just like he was so passionate that like it just boil over into just what we know today, because the whole reason why he eventually got to the point where he created Pokemon was because he wanted to make his own game, because he went from a fan to realizing that, hey, the games nowadays aren't as good as they could be, and so he took it upon himself to make a game that was up to snuff. And so he literally was just like a grassroots type of guy that went from being a fan to just thrusting himself into the developer role, kind of all on his own. But the next point I was going to get into is, you mentioned him doing a lot of the stuff from his parents' place, and that's another really cool facet of the story too, was during the development cycle of Pokemon Red and Green, it took 6 years to make the game, and that obviously was another huge point in the history, because that was literally the foundation, if you will. It was kind of like the make or break thing, and there was definitely a point where it was like more break than it was make, because there are reports famously that it was like not going good. The game was like about to bankrupt them, and there was employees that quit, and apparently Tajiri was even like not taking a salary, and he was just living off of his parents' income. Like that is just so incredible to me, and that's something that needs to be out there. I think people need to know about that, because he, like, in that situation, it could have easily all fallen apart. Like, that once again is another example that shows you he was so just like dedicated to this idea that he was willing to not even get paid for it. He was willing to like instantly like go bankrupt almost just after he had like created this company. So it's almost like a movie almost every time I think about this story, to where it's like it was almost just like blew up in his face before it even began. But the wherewithal that he had, and that Game Freak as a team had, to like push through and make it happen. It's like you don't see that when you just pick up Pokemon Red and Blue and play it. And so I think it's important for people to know just like all that went into that game, like when you're playing it.
Something else that's interesting to consider is that, you know, Satoshi Tajiri and his team didn't think that Pokemon was going to be this huge thing, and they were just hoping it could sell, 1 million copies, when Gen 1 ended up selling, I think, something almost 50 million. So, they were just kind of hoping, like, hopefully we can get to 1 million copies, and, like, it can be moderately successful. And, they weren't, like, mortgaging their future in hopes of getting rich and famous. They were just thinking, like, well, if we could just make this game, that'd be cool, and hopefully at least, some people like it, and we can sell a decent amount. And they never thought it was going to sell in the US. They never thought it was going to really leave Japan, and never thought it was going to be any kind of huge success, and it just kind of turned out that way. And so, yeah, they were really just kind of gambling without much of a sense of, without really even expecting to win big, which of course they did.
Yeah, and I just think that's incredible, and it's good that you actually bring up the whole localization, getting it out of Japan, because that's kind of the next place I was going to go to as far as a big moment in the history, because that's obviously what made the series able to actually go worldwide and become as big as it is, because it could have been the biggest thing ever in Japan, but if it never got out to the world, it would have never became the worldwide phenomenon, literally. And you, through your translations and stuff like that, recently brought to light kind of the wackiness, I would say, that was involved in localizing the Red and Green games, or Red and Blue, I should say, into English for the Western market. And there were talks of redesigning the Pokemon and changing up the art style. According to Tsunekazu Ishihara in interviews, they wanted to change, Nintendo of America that is, wanted to change all the designs of the Pokemon. They wanted to use a different art style from Sugimori's watercolor style. They basically wanted to change everything that makes Pokemon, and that obviously was another huge just tipping point, because it could have gone drastically bad if they would have did some of those things. And so to ultimately, the fact that they decided to keep it the way that it was made the whole process of localizing a lot bigger than it probably you would expect, because you think localizing is just like, oh, translate it from Japan to English, but there was a lot more that could have potentially happened that thankfully went the right way to allow it to ultimately succeed.
There was, I mean, like the whole, the highlight, of course, is Ishihara saying that Nintendo of America wanted to redesign all the Pokemon, and he specifically mentioned that they, gave Pikachu's redesign like some huge breasts, which is pretty funny, and that they thought there was like a 10% chance that it was going to be successful in America. And they really didn't, like Nobuo Gasawara, I think you probably know him. Maybe some folks don't. He's the guy who who basically translated almost all the text of the first 26 Pokemon games up through Diamond and Pearl. And he was a freelancer actually working for Nintendo of America. So it was like, they basically hired one Japanese-Canadian freelancer to translate the whole game into English. Like, they were really doing it on a small budget because they really didn't think it was going to work out. It's just interesting how little confidence they had in it and how little money they put into the localizations, and ended up, blowing up regardless. And I think a lot of people played them who couldn't even read as kids. And fortunately, the gameplay was so, perfect, I guess, that all the mistakes didn't really matter. And eventually they kind of reorganized things in the middle of Gen 4, and now it's much more centralized. They have a lot larger teams, and they spent a lot more money, obviously.
Yeah, it really is kind of puzzling how they were almost like not quite betting against themselves, but also sort of betting against themselves at the same time, because as you said, they weren't really expecting it to go anywhere. We touched on the struggles that they had a little bit earlier. Another big point that I wanted to mention is Creatures acquiring a third of the copyright of Pokemon, which was huge because that is why we have the Pokemon Company, because it's Creatures, Nintendo, and Game Freak. They all own a third, and the whole reason why that is because Game Freak were struggling financially so bad that Creatures had to come in and say, hey, we'll invest in your game to allow you to finish it, but we get part of the ownership. And that was huge because that just created the landscape that we know of today. Another really big reason, which is probably the most important, like the single most important moment in my opinion as far as Pokemon, is the whole story about Mew getting put into the game, because I think that took it from a point where it was like, okay, we have this fun game that is a new experience, especially for the time, and it was doing okay, all things considered at that point, from what we know. But when the Mew rumors started circling is when everything started to blow up, and that was honestly way bigger than just the simple idea of having a rare Pokemon in the game that you can't get unless you win a contest or something. After the game was debugged, meaning it was done, they had got all the bugs out and it was finished, they included Mew into the game absolute last second. Apparently Nintendo themselves didn't even know that it was a thing. It was Game Freak internal only. It was kind of an inside job, which is, I mean, think about that in terms of a business decision. That's a huge risk to kind of go under the nose of the people who are publishing your game. So just the guts that move took was huge, and to have it pay off in the way that it did, I think personally that is what made Pokemon what it is, because it started the phenomenon of the playground rumors, where it's oh, you have this Pokemon, how do you get it? And it just kind of spiraled out of control to where you had kids making up things that were completely untrue. But that talk and that discussion is what made Pokemon so just irresistible for kids, because you couldn't get enough of the potential of finding a new Pokemon or a new area in the game. And I think that's kind of what really made it, at least in my view, the franchise that it's what gave it its main appeal, and is kind of the catalyst that really started to make it more of less of a just a fad, I guess you could say, and more of an actual phenomenon.
Yeah, there's an Iwata Asks interview with Morimoto and a few other people who I'm sure you've read. And Morimoto's told this story a few times of how basically the sales were good but not great, and then word got out that there was, you know, a secret 151st Pokemon, and then sales like doubled and tripled and quadrupled, and then it was like #1 on the sales charts, and all because he'd slipped in Mew after the debug. I don't fully even understand it myself. It's just like that one thing for some reason like shot it up to the top of the charts and made it the best-selling game, which is of course what led it to get localized into you know, in English and the other languages. So yeah, I mean, like, really this series never would have been what it is today, and might have never been even a Gen 2 if it hadn't been for that sneaking in of Mew after the, you know, the clock ran out, which is pretty weird story. But yeah, it's definitely one of the most important moments in series history. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is actually some Gen 2 stuff that I want to get into as well, but that's actually going to be over on the second part of the video. We've kind of been talking for a while so far, so we're going to wrap it up for this episode, or this video I should say, and continue in the second part, which will be over on the UCast Studios gaming channel, where I have these discussions as well. Description or link will be in the description for that. So yeah, so be sure to join us over there. Me and Dr. Lava will both be over there, and if you're new to this channel, be sure to like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and check out Dr. Lava on his channel and on his Twitter as well. His links to his stuff will be in the description as well. Definitely check him out. So with that being said, thank you guys. We'll see you over for part 2. I'll be back here with a new video very soon as well. And until then, as always, smell you guys later.